Hey, what's up everyone? This is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to part 3 of my Sample Alchemy tutorial series. In this video, I'm going to focus on the source controls at the bottom of Sample Alchemy, and I'll also show you what I believe to be the real special sauce of this instrument that allows you to use any loop regardless of what notes are in the loop, and you'll still be able to create something that is playable with chords, leads, basses, you name it, and the pitch of the instrument will still come out correctly. We'll get to that later in the video, but for now, let's start by breaking down each of the source controls and synthesis modes. Now, let's go ahead and just recall the default setting. I'm going to drag in a loop from Logic's loop library. I'm going to search up Mastermind, and I'm looking for Mastermind Clarinet. Okay, so we're using a lot of the same notes there, especially at the very beginning. One thing that might be really helpful here is to go into the trim page, and let's snap to transients, and let's just snap the first trim point right to the first transient, and then I can trim out the back end just like so. Let's go back to the play page, and then what I can do is I can snap to the beat, or I can snap to transients. I'll go ahead and snap to transients. So now source A here is snapping to that transient. Hear how at the beginning here, everything's good, but once it gets over here, the tuning, the key of the chords just doesn't sound right. There's some weird dissonances. And by the way, all of the examples here are just a bunch of chords. If you're going to use just like a single source, you might want to try using loop scrub or bow mode to contain that source within a certain range that works. And again, I'm going to show you a way to get around this later in the video, but for now, we don't know that. We haven't talked about that yet. So we're just going to keep it simple, and I'll keep source A right where it's at. But I might want to loop this and only pull in the content from this very first part that's all staying on one note. And remember, if you don't think that the sample is loud enough, you can click on these 3 dots, go to global, and you can pull up the trim adjustment that's automatically applied when you drag or drop a sample in. By the way, I'm also using a little reverb using Black Hole from Eventide just to kind of smooth out any artifacts. Let's go ahead and pull in our second source. And I'm going to make this one loop in reverse. If I wanted this to sound more like a pad, I could pull up the attack time a bit. I could pull up the release time a bit. I'll keep the sustain at 100%. Okay, so the loops are kind of clashing with each other. So what can we do? Well, down here in this area, these are the source controls. You can choose each individual source, and you can control all of these parameters here individually for each source, or you can select all and you can apply them to all. So let's say that maybe source A, I want to pan over to the left a little bit. Source B, I want to pan over to the right a little bit. So it's going to maybe help separate these loops. Additionally, you can apply coarse or fine tuning to each source. So right now, source B is up 12 semitones, so that's up an octave. I can option click on this to bring it down an octave. This one's on the correct octave. But let's say we wanted that up an octave. Let's set it to 12 semitones. Another way to use this is you could try fine-tuning and creating just a little bit of detuning between the two sources. So maybe B I could pull up a few cents, and then A I could pull down a few cents, just to kind of create a like a stereo detuning effect. Or for example, let's say I'm working in arpeggiator mode. I'll pull down the release a bit. I'll turn down the attack a bit. Let's pull the sustain down, pull up the decay. Let's add in our other sources. And I'm going to have to be really careful because I don't want to put the source on a note that is going to make the chords clash. If I move it over here, this note is on a completely different pitch than the starting pitch. So we're hearing some dissonance there. But what's cool about this is you can do other things with your arpeggiated sources. So maybe I want A to be pan center. Then maybe B, we want to pan this over to the right, make it go up an octave. Maybe just something like that. Reset the fine tuning. Then C, maybe we want that over to the left. Maybe this one we want to be down an octave. And then the final one, we can leave it where it's at. So there's different things you can do with it. I think I'm just going to go back to loop mode. Yeah, so I think this patch sounds a lot better in loop mode, making sort of like a pad type instrument. I've also slowed down the loop speed for both of these just so they're not running so quickly. So next up, let's talk about the synthesis modes. This is where things really start to get interesting. Different synthesis modes can be chosen for each source. So for example, if I want A to be granular, that's the default, I can do that. But then I can click on B, and I can change this over to another type of synthesis, like additive synthesis. Regardless of what synthesis mode you select, the up and down position, the Y position of the source on the waveform is generally speaking going to default to this very first control. So if I go back to source A, you'll see that there's this little orange boundary around it. And what that means is when I pull up, the granular size or the grain size goes up. If I pull down, the grain size goes down. So there are these sort of built-in modulation features in the up and down axis of the waveforms. Now, in the second one, additive here, it's not there. Yeah, in this one, I've turned it off. But if you want to show that modulation, what you can do is click on that knob, then go up to the modulation matrix, and you can turn that on for waveform Y. So that's the Y-axis is controlling the additive symmetry B. If I switch over to granular, now it's controlling the granular size. Go over to spectral, now it's controlling the formant shift. So again, this first control is by default going to be mapped to the up and down Y-axis of the waveform. And we'll find out in the next video that you can actually customize these things even further and create your own modulation effects. So let's talk about what each of these synthesis types are, starting with granular synthesis. So I'm going to just go to one source just to demonstrate these. So the basic premise behind granular synthesis is that sound can be broken into tiny pieces or tiny little loops called grains. So when you play this back in granular mode, the playhead is not just playing the sample from beginning to end like it would, say, in Quick Sampler. The playhead is actually breaking apart the audio at the playhead into many different grains, and you're hearing the combination of all of those grains together, which is why when you use granular mode, things tend to sound a bit more diffuse, like there's more than one source going on at the same time. So you can control the size of the grain between 2 milliseconds and 230 milliseconds. And again, the grain size is automatically mapped to the y-axis. What you'll find is if you use a smaller grain, things are going to sound like they're more chopped up. They're going to sound more granular, more diffuse. And at really low values, things will just kind of degrade into noise. Whereas if you use a larger grain size, things will tend to be a bit more smooth, because each grain that's being played is a bit longer and is encompassing more of the original sample. You can also adjust the density, and the density is going to control the number of grains that are being played at any given point in time. So I like to put this on 10 because I like to hear more grains, which tends to smooth out the sound a bit. And one thing you'll notice is this second control will often have a little orange container around it showing that there's additional modulation paired to that. If you select that knob and then go up into the mod matrix, you'll see that the grain density is being controlled by Aftertouch. So if you don't have an Aftertouch keyboard, you can just turn that off. Don't even worry about it. But you could, if you wanted to, you could set this to something else like velocity, or you could set it to the modulation wheel. So now the modulation wheel will control the density. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off for this example. In addition to size and density, you can randomize the timing of each grain, and you can also randomize the pan of each grain. So I'm going to start at sort of like a middle setting, and I'm going to sweep these around and find something that smooths out this clarinet sample so I can use it in a more pad-like instrument. Yeah, we're not hearing the specific rhythm of the original loop anymore. We're hearing it more as like these fluttering echoes, these fluttering clarinet tones. So let's go ahead and bring in B. I'm going to also play around with the settings here. So that's granular mode. This mode works great if you want to really impart a lot of the tone of the loop and you don't want to go too crazy with the synthesis or the modulation effects. One thing you'll also notice is in granular mode, the granular effect is always going to be the same, classic. There's no menu here to choose a different granular effect. However, if you use one of the other modes, you'll see that there are these menus that allow you to choose additional modes or spectral effects and additive effects. They're almost like a sub mode or like a specific set of controls for this type of synthesis or a specific type of filter that's being applied to the original sample. So I'm going to go back to just source A for now, and let's jump over to additive mode. So what is additive synthesis? With additive synthesis, you are layering up additional sine wave oscillator tones to enhance the sound with additional harmonics. So you'll notice that a lot of the controls in additive mode are based around harmonics and partials. The symmetry of the harmonics, whether you want more odd or more even harmonics. You can apply a pitch variation to each harmonic, and you can also set the number of partials or the number of harmonics that are in the signal. So as you pull this down, things will get more simple. As you pull it up, you'll hear more of those harmonics. So once again, the very first knob, the symmetry, is automatically set up to be paired with waveform Y. So with this controller, you're going to find that if you keep the source more centered on the waveform, you're going to get a darker tone. As you move away, you're going to get more of like a metallic type sound. Now, like I said, there are multiple additive effects that you can pick from. The partials lock effect is honestly the best option in Sample Alchemy for using loops. This is what I was talking about before. This is kind of the special sauce of Alchemy, but I'm going to come back to partials lock in just a bit. But what I want to do now is just go through each of the modes and play around with some of the controls, because the controls are all different for each of these. And it's honestly not really worth it to go through every single one and explain what every single knob specifically does to the signal. If this is more just like a use your ears type of moment and settle on a sound that works best for you. So harmonic mode seems like it adds odd or even harmonics, it adds fifths, it adds octaves, and you can also adjust the level of the fundamental. So if you want an additive sound that's going to sound the most like the original, harmonic is probably the best way to go. And then there's two other modes, formant and formant synth. These function kind of similarly to like a vocoder, where they use like a formant filter to filter out and blend the original source sample with the synthesizer. Because again, remember, in additive mode, we're adding additional oscillator tones to the existing sample and blending them together with the original sample. So we're going to come back to additive mode, again, especially this partials lock mode. But let's jump over to Spectral and let's try out a few of these. So with Spectral mode, there are 6 custom modes or spectral effects that you can use. Every single one is going to result in a different type of sound. So spectral synthesis lets you build sounds by combining multiple harmonics and filtered noise signals. So this type of synthesis is, again, kind of like with the additive formant modes. It's kind of similar to a vocoder, but it tracks the peaks in the overall spectrum rather than individual amplitudes and at certain frequency points. So it always tracks the peak of the overall spectrum. So as a result, this synthesis mode tends to sound more warped than granular or additive. So I'm just going to play through a few of these and just give you an idea of what each one sounds like. Yeah, so the formant mode sounds a lot like the formant modes in the additive mode, and I really love the metalize effect here. I think it sounds really cool. Now, the last one, noise, is just going to produce noise. So it's essentially replacing the sample with noise. So granular is best if you want things to sound the most like the original sample. Additive is when you want to add additional synthesizer oscillators to enhance the tone even more and layer them with the original sample. And spectral when you want to create more warped effects. Okay, so I promised you I would show you what I believe to be the best mode to work with when you're working with loops as source material. You may recall from a previous video that Sample Alchemy works best with loops and samples that contain a lot of the same notes or have notes that are in octaves, because when you use a loop that has a lot of different notes, like a melody or a bass line or chords, the playback will often not stay in key because there's too many individual notes within the sample or loop. So you can't play things like chords because the non-chord tones are going to be coming through in the playback. So for example, if I set this to arpeggiator mode and pulled in all 4 of the sources and I, snap these to some different locations, it just sounds like nonsense because the notes at the different sources are different pitches than the starting note. So I can't feasibly play chords and keep things in key. However, the special sauce here is that you just need to switch over to additive mode and use the partials lock mode. Because the partials lock mode locks the partials, it locks the harmonics, but moves the fundamental around, you can impart the tone of the original loop while making sure all notes that you play come through correctly. So the synthesizer is producing the fundamental here, whereas the original loop is sort of supplying and being blended with the output in order to impart the tone, in this case, of a clarinet with a synthesizer. But again, using partials lock mode will ensure that no matter what play mode you use, the notes you play are actually the notes you're going to hear, and things will stay in key and stay in tune. Let's go a little faster. Go 16th notes. Let's pull the sustain down, pull the release down a bit, pull the attack down. So you can hear that all the chords are there. All of the right notes are being hit in each of the chords. Let's go ahead and try a different sample just for demonstration. I'm going to search up this one called Deep Dive Synth Lead, and I'm going to use Deep Dive Synth Lead 1. So this is a synth melody. It's playing multiple different notes. If I drag it in, I can, again, using additive and partials lock mode, I can set the sources wherever I want. I'm going to go ahead and snap them to transients. All the chords are arpeggiating perfectly. If I were to switch these over to granular mode, it's going to sound like nonsense. Because the pitch at each source is being accounted for and included in the output. But again, switch these over to additive, and that solves all of those problems. Okay, there's one last thing I want to show you in this video, and this is the filter. This is very simple. This is a filter that can be a low pass, a band pass, a high pass filter, comb filter, a downsample filter, or an FM filter. Typically, I use the low band pass and high pass filters. But this filter can be applied globally to all 4 sources. So if this global button is on, this means that the cutoff frequency and the filter type is going to be applied to every single source. And of course, just like most filters, you have a cutoff frequency control as well as a resonance or feedback control. However, let's say that we wanted to apply this filter to only sources C and D. So what I can do is I can turn off the global button, and then I can go to each one of the sources. So A, it's bypassed. B, it's also bypassed. C, let's go ahead and turn that on. Pull down the cutoff, pull up the resonance a bit. Go to D, turn on the filter, set the cutoff, set the resonance. So now only C and D have that low pass filter applied. Okay, so those are the source controls and the synthesis modes in Sample Alchemy. If you liked this video, please leave it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this. I should have the final part, part 4, out very soon, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for the support, and thanks for watching.